Hello, everyone. This week for our class, I am going to be discussing working with grief with families because I think that this is something, regardless of the discipline that you practice from, as marriage and family therapists, this is something that we face with our clients on an ongoing regular basis. And being aware of how to treat grief most effectively in families is something that is so very important. And I think, too often, especially in our culture, we tend to gloss over the issues of death and even talking about death. We don't even like to say that word very often. And oftentimes, especially for young children, many times the adults haven't actually talked to them about what death even means, let alone recognizing that young children, as well as the older siblings and adults, need help sometimes processing death, especially when it has been a shocking, unexpected event, as well as when it's been a very meaningful relationship that has come to an end. And so one of the first things I think is so important is first we need to explain what death is, especially when we're working with children with young families. So we often have this kind of wishy-washy language, right? We say, oh, your uncle passed away, or we lost your grandma last night. Well, for a young child who's still in that concrete operational stage of development, if you say that we lost something or someone, they're going to have a very concrete understanding of what that means, right? And that can be a panicky, like, oh, wait, he's lost. Like, we have to go find grandma. What happened to grandma? Right? Because we haven't actually discussed what death means. And same thing when we say things like, oh, your auntie's in a better place. Well, from a young child's perspective, what could be better than being with me? And does that mean that I'm bad or I did something bad that my favorite auntie doesn't want to be with me anymore? And it's normal and natural for there to be longing to be with the loved one who's passed away, especially when we talk about things like, oh, your auntie's up with the angels and heaven is so wonderful. And a lot of young children struggle with that, and parents sometimes can become very concerned when a child will express a desire to be with their deceased loved one or say that they want to go to heaven too, because that's where grandpa is. And this could be really scary for parents, not understanding that because of that stage of development, it makes sense that this language would be coming. And there is that possibility, especially in complex grief. And when there's been traumatic grief, that there can develop some suicidal ideation of not wanting to be present on this earth anymore when the loved one isn't there. And this happens across ages and stages. We know that, for adult partners who experience complex traumatic grief, having suicidal ideation and even becoming suicidal can be something that can happen. And so as a clinician, it's so important that we have language to talk about death. We can help parents explain what death is to their children. And then working from a systemic perspective, really helping the family to come together to navigate this huge transition in a healthy way and effectively is something that each of us needs to learn skills to master how to do this. So my two research articles for class this week, I really liked Gould's research. And his research, the title of this is Generating a Vocabulary of Mourning, Supporting Families Through Grief and Loss. Through the process of grief. And Gould describes grief as a critical transition that happens across the lifespan, right? And across families, and especially, and most importantly, across cultures. And so as a clinician, we need to be culturally competent not only in our everyday practice, of course, but specifically to the grief process. And recognizing that each culture, each religion, each family within the broader culture is going to have their own unique grief process, as well as language and expectations as to what that process should be like. And in his article, he goes through and highlights, some of the unique cultures around death and grieving with different religious groups. And I think that that's really important for us, because remembering that religion is also a huge piece of understanding somebody's culture, and recognizing that your worldview, or kind of the Americanized gloss over the grief process expectation, may not be appropriate for the families that we work with. And it isn't appropriate for the families that we work with often. But understanding the family's culture, understanding their rights and rituals around grief and dying, and especially the expectations of bereavement, is so important. We have a tendency to pathologize. If I could enunciate words today, it would be great. To pathologize grief and bereavement in our culture, right? We tend to give people about 3 weeks and then they're supposed to be better, right? And we know that grief is much more complicated than that. And so part of our responsibility as clinicians is to recognize and ask, what our clients' cultural experiences are, and expectations and rituals, and being mindful and practicing cultural humility and understanding and compassion, especially if their rituals look different from yours. And this is going to be the case regardless of who you're working with, because we know that the family's culture and their practices within the broader cultural practices is going to be unique to each client system that we work with. One of the things that I really liked about this Gold's article is understanding and normalizing grief and bereavement, and that reminder that we need to be practicing from a space of cultural humility. So it's important to ask questions, right? Not to make your clients the teacher of you if you don't understand, but making sure that you're seeking out so that you may not be unintentionally or unconsciously superimposing your own cultural expectations on their grief process. And I think that that is a very important, humbling reminder for each of us that we need to be practicing cultural humility across all aspects of the therapeutic process. One of the things towards the ends of the article that Gold discusses is the importance of creating meaning-making work and validating through this each individual members of the family, their own little idiosyncratic ways of managing grief within the systemic perspective of working together as a unit to process grief. And I think that that piece is so important. And sometimes we miss that as clinicians, and we focus on the individual client or the more surface level, functionality of, moving through grief instead of integrating the grief process and allowing permission for this to take place across the system. And this moves into actually Sims' article, where they develop a family systems therapy model for addressing grief. And, Sims discusses how we have a death-denying and defying culture, which I thought was such an interesting perspective on kind of this westernized view of not only how we discuss death and grief, but also how we live it, especially here in America, where we drive fast, we have horrible eating habits, all these things that maybe help us ramp up death faster because of lifestyle habits and choices. But this idea of death denying and death defying, I think, is so important for us to kind of tack onto our mental corkboards, because it makes sense, from the broader cultural experience and kind of like the American westernized world that we live in, that this happens. And so when then death does occur, it's so important that we, again, acknowledge and treat the death, and not just the peripheral issues that come from this. And I appreciated in this article how Sims, really dives into and kind of expounds upon Bowlby's and some others' works about the death, the grief timeline. Because I think that this, we often are familiar with, like, the Kubler-Ross model, it's like these neat little stages, which we know death and grief is not neat little stages. But I think sometimes we forget how to normalize grief. And so the first stage of grief is shock, right? Like, this just happened. I wasn't prepared. I don't know how to deal with this. And from the therapeutic process, this is where family treatment tends to be most intensive, because the family's in crisis. They're trying to wrap their head around this huge life-altering change that just happened to their system, and figuring out how to manage this. And this stage leads then into the disorganization stage, where there's chaos. Everyone's kind of in survival mode. They're trying to figure out how to cope, how to move forward, how to live life without their loved one present. And then this last stage is reorganization, which is, in a healthy development, there's been an integration of the meaning of death, the meaning of the life the person lived. And there's been an integration of who I am from this pre-death to post-death experience. And in successful reorganization, we know that the family and individuals within the family are able to move on and move forward in life and not become stuck in grief. And our therapeutic process moves along that same, realm of reorganization as well, when it's more crisis-centered work, to, we know that, working phases of our clinical work, and then moving towards termination. And this is kind of a parallel process that the family's experiencing as well, as they become more reorganized and redefined. Then there's another grief, that comes as part of that, as kind of that shedding process, where the therapeutic relationship ends at the same time, which I think is a really interesting way to be thinking about the power of the therapeutic relationship, and recognizing too, when we're practicing from a systemic lens, how important it is that we are also maximizing attachments outside of just us, because our role is temporary. And so we want to help the family system develop support systems and attachment figures beyond the therapeutic relationship, so that they have these things in place in their life when the therapeutic process ends. And I think that, this is something, when we can take that ecosystemic model and put that to systems therapy as well, that's something that I think really helps the family in the long run adjust and learn how to process through the experience. And I think it's important for us as clinicians that we stop pathologizing bereavement. That's just my own little soapbox, but we know that it's actually normal and natural for grief and bereavement to last up to 2 years. And, we've kind of pathologized grief to be like, well, if it's not over within a couple of months, something must be wrong with the individual. And we know that that just is kind of an unfair practice and label to give to somebody. And one of the other things I would just add, that's not in the literature, but just practicing from, a family therapy model, it's also really important that grief comes in stages, and that happens differently for each member of the family. So it's not uncommon when there are children and young children involved in the family system that they experience delayed grief. And for a lot of parents, this catches them off guard because, they're finally in a place where they're moving forward and have been able to work through their grief. And then all of a sudden, a year up to 2 years later, when a child finally begins experiencing their grief process, that can be really painful for the parents who have worked so hard to move through their own. And so I think that this idea of understanding that there is some cycles to the grief work that we do, and helping parents understand that delayed grief is actually really normal and common in their young children. And, there's kind of this idea in child psychotherapy that, a child kind of holds on to their own stuff to kind of take care of the adults. And once the adult is in a place where they can take care of the child, then there's room for the child's grief to come to the surface. And so this then also is important that we recognize the shame piece that can come into the parenting world of, a parent feeling less than able, and having shame around that they weren't emotionally available for their child when this big event happened because they were so wrapped up in their own grief. And I think we need to really become that safe haven for the family system and the parents especially, not just the child in the work that we do, so we can hold space for all the different nuances that grief can trigger. So anyways, I look forward to our discussion this week, and I hope you enjoy these articles, and I'll talk to you soon. Thanks, everyone.